Today is March 6, 2023. I want to talk about the ongoing Russian military operations in Ukraine. As always, let's start by looking at liveuamap.com. It is a pro-Ukrainian live map. Keep that in mind when we look at it. Of course, we can see that there is pressure Russia is placing all along the line of contact. There is fighting reported all around Donetsk city. And of course, Bakhmut continues to be encircled. And you can see how extensive it is, even on this pro-Ukrainian map. You can see these rifle icons in the city. That means there's fighting reported in the city. And you can see how Russian control over territory is extending westward far past Bakhmut, taking control over the roadways going into Bakhmut, and the pincers, if you will, closing in on Bakhmut. And then if we go up north, we see fighting continues along the line of contact. Fighting and artillery exchanges continue all along the line of contact. Now, there's a lot of predictions about when Russia will finally take control over Bakhmut, and I will refrain from doing that because I believe there are a lot of factors that will determine when Russia takes over Bakhmut, and it includes the disposition of both Russian and Ukrainian forces in that area. It involves Russia's ability to sustain the fighting forces in those pincers as far westward as they have gone, and also their ability to encircle and close that gap around Bakhmut, and then repel any sort of Ukrainian counterattack from within the encirclement and from outside of it. Will they be able to repel those counterattacks? Is Ukraine even able to conduct counterattacks? I don't know what the real disposition of Ukrainian and Russian forces are in that area, so I couldn't tell you, but we need to keep a very close eye on this fighting because that is what is happening. The city is being encircled, and it appears that Ukrainian forces are attempting at least a partial withdrawal from the city. This situation around Bakhmut and the so-called winter offensive in general, this is something that a lot of people were just assuming was going to happen. But Russia never announced any sort of plans for a big major winter offensive. Nothing has been announced or is said to be ongoing. Of course, there is this push around Bakhmut, but it is the same type of offensive that we've seen all throughout the special military operation. These are Russian forces pushing toward an objective very slowly, carefully, cautiously, and taking territory very, very incrementally. It is not these big sweeping attacks that Ukraine attempts to carry out. Now, Russia could carry out these type of attacks. They have the men, they have the equipment, they could do it, but they're very costly in terms of manpower and equipment lost. We saw this when Ukraine carried out its Kharkov and Kherson offensives. They lost brigades worth of men and equipment. Russia does not want to do that. They can achieve their objectives more slowly, more incrementally, but inevitably, and they can preserve their fighting power, their manpower and their equipment while doing so. While eliminating Ukrainian manpower and equipment. Speaking of Bakhmut, there's a lot of articles coming out about what's going on in regards to Bakhmut. And I saw this one from the Wall Street Journal, shared by Donbas Davushka on Telegram. And it's titled, "Russia's Wagner Troops Exhaust Ukrainian Forces in Bakhmut." And right under there it says, "Deadly fight against the penal battalions threatens Kiev's ability to mount spring offensive." They're talking about just this private military company, Wagner, doing this to the entirety of Ukraine's military. And it doesn't seem clear whether or not they realize there are over 300,000 Russian reservists that have been mobilized and are still waiting to join the fighting. Doesn't really seem like they understand that. The article says Ukraine is suffering large casualties here that could sap its ability to mount a spring offensive with new weapons supplied by the US and allies. President Volodymyr Zelensky has come under growing pressure to pull back from the eastern city, home to 70,000 people before the war, and what would be Kiev's first such significant retreat since last summer. Wagner, which began its assaults on Bakhmut in July, keeps inching closer to the remaining two supply roads and to the shrinking salient as its men fight house to house on approaches to the city's central neighborhoods. The article also goes on and says such losses in the Bakhmut area are threatening Kiev's ability to mount a strategic counteroffensive once the current mud season ends in the spring and unpaved roads become passable again. The war is won not by the party that gains territory, but the party that destroys the armed forces of the adversary, said Senior Lieutenant Harbatinko, the 3rd Storm Brigade Battalion commander. That is something that I have been saying since the special military operation began, all the way back in February of last year. And I remember a lot of people saying, no, it's whoever's holding the most territory. Well, now even Ukrainian battalion commanders are admitting that no, it's you can have all of this territory that you've taken, but if your army disappears while doing it and there's no one left to defend it, then guess what? Then the enemy, who has preserved their fighting capacity, gets to take it away from you. And this has been Russia's strategy this entire time. And now we're finally seeing it vindicated, essentially. They also say, here we are using up too much of the offensive potential that we'll need for a breakthrough once Ukraine's black earth dries up. And it also says Ukrainian combat casualties are classified. Officers in some other brigades say that several units, including some of the best prepared ones, have been routed by fighting in the Bakhmut area in recent months. And this is something that I have been covering. Others have been covering. The Duran, Alex Christoforou, and Alexander Mercouris, and many others have been covering this for months now. And now the Western media is finally coming around and admitting to all of this. And this is something that I was talking about in my last update when I cited Michael Kaufman. He's a Ukrainian-born analyst working for these one of these US-based think tanks, policy think tanks. And he was claiming that what we're seeing right now is the big Russian winter offensive, and it's not Ukraine that's being exhausted. Russia is exhausting itself. And once this offensive peters out, Ukraine will have the opportunity and the advantage in launching its spring offensive. And I just don't see that. What I see Russia doing, and I mentioned this in my last update, was putting pressure all along the line of contact in what is essentially a theater-wide spoiling operation, denying Ukraine an operational pause where it can prepare its offensive. It's going to have to commit a lot of these troops that it wants to use, just as the Wall Street Journal article said. They're going to have to use these troops to stop Russia from advancing in places like Bakhmut. They're being pulled into Bakhmut. It's like a black hole, and Russia is just destroying all of these troops and equipment. And this is happening to an extent that may possibly impact Ukraine's planned spring offensive. Now, what about the actual fighting? I saw this article, and actually I saw the original source where this headline came from. And I just think it's important to point out how absurd the West's propaganda has become in this late stage. This is from Voice of America, U.S. government-funded media. Russia-Ukraine fighting devolves into hand-to-hand combat. What are they talking about? The article says much of Russia's year-long invasion in Ukraine has devolved into infantry fighting in the eastern regions of the country, in part because Moscow's forces are short on artillery munitions, the British Ministry of Defense said Sunday. Well, I'm going to actually show you elsewhere in the Western media that admits it's Ukraine that is suffering a critical artillery shell shortage. In its latest assessment, London said recent evidence suggests an increase in close combat in Ukraine. This is probably a result of the Russian command continuing to insist on offensive action, largely consisting of dismounted infantry. The ministry said that late last month, Russia mobilized reservists who have described being ordered to assault a Ukrainian concrete strongpoint armed with only firearms and shovels. The shovels are likely entrenching tools being employed for hand-to-hand combat, it said. The lethality of the standard issue MPL-50 entrenching tools particularly mythologized in Russia, but that little has changed since its design in 1869. Its continued use as a weapon highlights the brutal and low-tech fighting, which has come to characterize much of the war, defense officials said. British defense officials said. One of the reservists described being neither physically nor psychologically prepared for the action. So this whole headline and this claim being made by the British Ministry of Defense comes from some random alleged reservist and his comment about being ordered to storm a position with his rifle and his shovel. It's obviously absurd. If Ukrainians have weapons and ammunition, there's no way a Russian soldier is reaching him and going to be using a shovel on him and living to tell the tale. So this is utterly absurd propaganda. The reality is that it's Ukraine running out of artillery ammunition, not Russia. And we have articles like this from Financial Times. Alexander Mikuris covered this in his recent video. The link will be in the video description below. The title is Ukraine asks EU for 250,000 artillery shells a month. Defense Minister Oleksiy Reznikov seeks big boost to ammunition supplies to ease critical shortages. Easier to say than to do. Ukraine has appealed to the EU to send Kiev 250,000 artillery shells a month to ease critical shortage that it warns is limiting its progress on the battlefield. So they're admitting they have a critical shortage. This isn't the Russian Ministry of Defense citing some random Ukrainian soldier and making this claim. This is Ukraine itself admitting they have this critical shortage. In a letter to his counterparts in the 27 member states on Friday, obtained by the Financial Times, Ukraine's defense minister writes that his country's forces are only firing a fifth of the rounds they could because of lack of supplies. The request far exceeds the help the EU is discussing sending, underlining the size of the task facing Kiev as its war with Russia enters its second year. Now, the EU is only discussing sending a certain amount because they're only capable of sending a certain amount. Just because Ukraine wants more shells doesn't mean the EU can magically produce them and send them. They have to actually physically produce them with their industry, and they are incapable of doing that at the moment. The article goes on and it says, Reznikov writes that artillery plays a crucial role in eliminating the enemy's military power. On average, Ukraine is firing 110,000 155 millimeter caliber shells a month, a quarter of the amount used by Russia. So Russia still has plenty of artillery. They just said it right there. So they're not sending troops with shovels to hit Ukrainians over the head. Pure war propaganda out of the UK Ministry of Defense because things are so desperately going against them and their proxies, their Ukrainian proxies. The article also says defense analysts say Kiev has more than 300 artillery systems, mostly donated by allies. Now, this last bit about Ukraine having around 300 artillery systems, they started out with well over 1,000. They've lost most of them. As the article itself says, these 300 artillery systems are mostly donated by NATO, and that is, again, a fraction of what Russia has. Altogether, Ukraine has 300-something artillery pieces. Russia has a variety of artillery pieces that they're using. Any one of these systems, they have hundreds of each type, and they have well over 1,000 artillery pieces out there on the battlefield. So what is the solution for this problem that Ukraine has? They don't have enough artillery shells, and in a roundabout way, they're saying they don't have enough artillery pieces either. This is what the Financial Times article says. The longer-term part of Borrell, they're talking about Joseph Borrell of the EU. His plan is aimed at boosting the size of the EU arms industry. Yes, that is a longer term plan. That will take years to do. So this is really not an option for Ukraine, is it? Borrell is working with the EU's industry commissioner on a plan to use 500 million euros of EU money to expand arms production by financing factory expansion, eliminating supply bottlenecks, and placing big orders to stimulate investments. And in factory expansion can take a year or longer to do. I believe it is time that the European defense industry moves to a wartime economy model to cater for our defense production needs. Again, that sounds great. It's something that is very easy to say, much harder to do. It will take years to do, and that's only if they actually decide to do it. I've already talked about how the United States is committed to expanding its artillery shell production. It will take place over several years, and even when that process that they've already agreed to do is done, they still will be supplying Ukraine with far fewer shells than it actually needs to match, let alone exceed what Russia has available to it. And just to drive this point home further, let's look at the U.S. Department of Defense's most recent security assistance for Ukraine. This is dated March 3rd, 2023. And you can see it's a very, very, very short list. Very short list. And notice there are no quantities at all mentioned for any of these munitions. Rockets for HIMARS, 155 millimeter rounds, 105 millimeter rounds, because they don't have enough 155 millimeter artillery pieces to give Ukraine. So they were sending 105 millimeter artillery pieces, and now also rounds to them, 25 millimeter ammunition, some vehicle launched bridges, and just these other odds and ends. Nothing at all really that is going to make any difference at all. And the fact that they are no longer listing quantities is not to fool Russia. Russia is not getting their information from Pentagon press briefings. They have their own intelligence resources to determine what is coming into the country and what is being distributed to different units across Ukraine. This is to hide the fact from the general public that they are out of weapons, they are out of ammunition to send Ukraine. The limits to their military industrial output have been reached, and it'll take years to expand them. And what they're doing, what we saw the British Ministry of Defense doing, is retreating into these fantastical narratives about Russia being the one out of ammunition and needing to use shovels as weapons because they're out of artillery rounds, when clearly that is projection. It is the Ukrainians that are out, and it is the West that is unable to give them more. Speaking of delusional, fantastical thinking, let's look at this from Reuters. Rheinmetall in talks on building tank factory in Ukraine. Ukraine's arms and defense industry has been eliminated. It was wiped out in the first couple of months of the special military operation. Russia used its cruise missiles, which can hit anywhere inside Ukraine. They destroyed factories. They also destroyed maintenance facilities all over Ukraine. This has forced Ukraine to open up facilities, or NATO to open up facilities for Ukraine in neighboring Poland. And everything has to be shipped to Poland, because if they open up any sort of significant maintenance facility inside Ukraine, Russia will find it and destroy it. But anyway, this is what the Reuters article is reporting. A Rheinmetall plant can be set up in Ukraine for around 200 million euros, which can produce up to 400 Panthers a year. Pappinger was quoted as saying, this is someone at Rheinmetall, Panthers are the company's latest battle tanks models. I think they need to get a better editor there. The Panther is still under development, and who named it the Panther, I would really like to know, because the Nazi Germany had a tank called the Panther that rolled into Russia. So they're talking about building a factory in a country that is in the middle of an armed conflict, a country where any factory that is built will be immediately destroyed by Russian cruise missiles. And they're talking about building hundreds of tanks that haven't even been finished being developed yet. Seems delusional and fantastical to me. And older articles like this one out of Bloomberg, Rheinmetall in talks to supply Ukraine with Panther battle tanks. This was from February 2023. And in this article, it says the Dusseldorf-based company has already held talks with the government in Kiev. Rheinmetall could produce the vehicles from scratch, meaning no country would have to provide tanks from their own inventories. It's also ready to install a facility in Ukraine for assembling the Panther once the war ends, as long as the German government approves the necessary export licenses. And so this is the same guy, Papinger. So in this Bloomberg article, he's talking about building this factory after the conflict is over. More recently, it sounds like they're trying to rush this deal. They want to make a decision in the next 1 or 2 months. And then Papinger has even talked about how he's not worried about Russian strikes. They can just use air defense systems to protect the factory, which is utterly absurd. There's no way that they can do this. So what does this tell you? What does it tell you? And I think one possibility is they must realize that when the conflict does actually end, there will be no Ukraine that exists where Germany can build its Rheinmetall tank factory within. That will not be a possibility. And so they want to get the publicity for making this deal, get their stock prices up, get their stock prices surging now before this whole opportunity is gone for good. And the Reuters article even ends saying Rheinmetall shares hit a record high in January after Germany's decision to send the heavy Leopard tanks to Ukraine. So maybe that's what this is about. It's about Rheinmetall trying to get its snout into the trough one last time before all of this is over. Continuing with the theme of desperation, let's go to CNN. U.S. evaluating Ukrainian pilots for possible F-16 training. The article says the U.S. is working with Ukrainian pilots in the United States to determine how long it will take to train them to fly F-16 fighter jets. 3 sources briefed on the matter told CNN. 2 Ukrainian pilots are currently at a military base in the U.S. having their skills tested in flight simulators to see how much time they would need to learn to fly various U.S. military aircraft, including F-16s. I've already gone into this topic. The British government already said that it would take years for Ukrainian pilot to learn how to fly any sort of NATO warplane. It doesn't matter which. Romania specifically has been switching over from Soviet-era warplanes to the F-16, and it has taken them a decade, and they're still not done doing it. And so if F-16s start showing up in Ukraine, just as Alex Christoforou said in his most recent video, I'll put a link to that in the video description below as well. If they start showing up in Ukraine now, you can guarantee that they are NATO pilots posing as Ukrainian pilots. And I call this desperation because Ukraine started the special military operation out with an air force, and Russia used its missiles to destroy it on the ground, and they used their air defense systems and their own military aviation to shoot them out of the sky. And that is what they have been doing all along over the last year as NATO sent helicopters and warplanes in piecemeal over the last several months. And that is exactly what's going to happen if and when they send F-16s. They will be destroyed on the ground. They will be shot out of the air, just as everything else Ukraine had. So that's where we are right now with the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. Russia has settled into this long-term war of attrition. It's a war of attrition, but they're also doing this incremental offensive, if you can call it that. They're inching along. They're preserving their fighting capacity while maximizing the loss of Ukrainian troops and equipment. We see the West resorting to propaganda and platitudes because they've run out of tangible military assistance to send Ukraine. The West is becoming increasingly desperate, and when they become increasingly desperate, they become increasingly dangerous. We need to keep a close eye on this conflict. We need to be on the lookout for escalation, because the West, as things are going right now, are obviously unsustainable. They will need to change. It's just a matter of in what direction.